Hello and welcome to part 7 of History Boffin's South Africa playlist. This is one of 3 videos that considers the period from 1910 to 1948, but the focus for this video is solely on the laws that discriminated against non-whites and combined to form a system that, while not as far-reaching as apartheid, certainly set a clear precedent. Segregation in South Africa was the result of attitudes developed through the 19th century, systems that were introduced in the diamond and gold mines, and a desire to regulate race relations. Above all else, it was about control. There were many segregation-era laws, but as ever, historians are selective in the examples they use, and we are considering just a few key pieces of legislation. First of all, I'm presenting them in chronological order. In 1911, the Mines and Works Act prohibited strikes by black mine workers and provided a system by which qualifications needed for skilled roles were only provided to whites, with most qualifications already held by blacks removed over time. The Native Labour Regulation Act issued licences to recruiters who hired black labour from their territories in South Africa and nearby British colonies such as Bechuanaland. This reinforced the migrant labour system, whereby black men lived and worked hundreds of miles away from their home. Crucially, the creation of labour districts led to an expanded pass system, whereby all black men had to carry a pass containing their personal details, place of work, and length of contract. Movement outside the labour district was prohibited, and blacks could not break their contract. The Natives Land Act was arguably the most significant law of the segregation era. It prohibited blacks from owning or renting land outside declared reserves, which at the time constituted just 7% of the land in South Africa, and poor quality land at that. It did stipulate that the land allocated to blacks should increase, but persistent pressure from whites meant that expansion was slow, and by 1939, the reserves constituted just 12% of the total land in the country. White pressure also led to another crucial component of the Natives Land Act by banning sharecropping, a practice of tenant farming. Blacks were thus denied the opportunity to farm for themselves and sell surplus produce. Instead, they were forced into labourer roles on white-owned farms or increasingly in mines and factories. The employment laws and the Natives Land Act meant that throughout the 1910s, black migrant labour expanded dramatically, and this increased further during the First World War. The flocking of blacks to towns and cities led to blacks and whites living together. Thus, the 1923 Native Urban Areas Act gave local authorities the power to create areas into which all blacks, except domestic workers, were forced. In time, white urban areas became gentrified, with decent standards of infrastructure and amenities. In turn, black areas were neglected and quickly became slums. To control the movement of blacks in urban areas, blacks were required to carry passes that outlined their nature and place of work. The Industrial Conciliation Act built on the Native Labour Regulation Act by implementing various obstacles that prevented blacks from striking. While the Mines and Works Amendment Act strengthened the original 1911 Act, meaning there was a clear colour bar, with whites at the top, coloured and Indians below, and blacks at the bottom. The Immorality Act was significant in that it signalled segregation within private lives and was a foundation for many of the petty apartheid laws that followed. Prison sentences of up to 5 years could be issued to anyone caught having extramarital interracial relations. Finally, but importantly, the Natives Representation Act removed the only franchise for blacks that existed in South Africa. If you will recall from the last video, in 1910 the Union of South Africa came into being, and one agreement was that the 4 provinces could determine their own voting rights. In Cape Province, some blacks retained the vote, although they only made up about 15% of the electorate there. The 1936 Act removed this entitlement, and instead blacks were able to elect 4 white representatives who would supposedly represent them. In practice, it meant the end of black political rights. However, we have spoken about exam boards not wanting students to write stories, and thus considering the acts chronologically is less valuable than trying to link the acts in terms of themes. This is an essential skill known as categorization. Let's look at our acts again. We can identify 4 acts that segregated the workplace. We can also link together 2 acts that focused on separating where and how blacks and whites lived. There is 1 act that was political in nature and 1 act that was social. Thus, we have taken our knowledge of the acts one stage further. But let's take our understanding of the acts further again, because as historians we are often concerned with cause and effect. Many exam boards do not focus on the segregation era acts themselves, but the impact of them on blacks. Using our colour coding, we can consider the impacts. The Natives Land Act and Native Urban Areas Act, in their own ways, led to overpopulation in black areas. Housing was of a poor quality, and as overuse of water and land led to dried up rivers and a dust bowl effect in the reserves, farming collapsed, leading to starvation and malnutrition. In the 1920s and 1930s, over 20% of black children never made it to their first birthday. The Natives Land Act also led to a migrant labour system, which provides a nice link to our next category of acts. The 4 acts in green all contributed to a system where blacks were on far less pay than whites. For instance, in 1939, white workers in factories and construction could expect over 5 times the pay of blacks. Meanwhile, conditions were poor with single-sex dormitories, dangerous conditions in the mines, and regular fines. Most essays require 2 or 3 factors to be considered, so our third chosen impact relates to the Natives Representation Act, but also the Native Urban Areas Act. As well as the obvious political right, voting rights, being removed, blacks also had other political rights, such as the right to free movement, taken away. The lack of political representation was a key factor behind the growth of opposition groups, which we will consider shortly. Our final approach, having considered the details of the impacts, is to label them. In this case, I would suggest employment conditions, overcrowding, and political rights as suitable labels to remember. Thus, we can now think more carefully about how we demonstrate understanding to an examiner. The question, why did the situation for black South Africans worsen between 1910 and 1948, is a typical 6-mark question in the Cambridge IGCSE examination, and many students will be aware of the Peel structure. In answering this question, students should provide 2 impacts, 2 paragraphs. At A-level and IB diploma level, typical essay questions would require 3 factors to be analysed in greater detail, and a judgment reached in some way. The labels can serve as a point sentence, with details of some of the relevant acts provided to demonstrate knowledge, followed by a clear explanation of the impact, which includes sentence starters and connectives such as therefore, thus, and leading to. Finally, a quick sentence to paraphrase the question and conclude your explanation is often the difference between full marks and almost full marks. Here is one finished paragraph that could be used. Feel free to pause and read it. Remember, for full marks you'd need to write another paragraph explaining another factor, perhaps employment conditions or political rights. Let's briefly turn our attention to how blacks responded to segregation laws. Opposition was very limited. Blacks were not permitted to own weapons, while whites were readily armed, particularly in rural areas, and the police and army developed as formidable forces over time. This made violent resistance impossible. Furthermore, there were clear differences between ethnic groups, meaning a coherent opposition policy to the state failed to materialise. Tribal chiefs found themselves reliant on authorities for money, power and prestige, and often muted any grievances within their areas. Finally, the thought of action, political or otherwise, was far from the minds of the hundreds of thousands who struggled to survive from day to day. That said, some opposition did slowly develop, and these were overwhelmingly political, with a very British attitude of representations and appeals, charters and negotiation. This was because the leaders of these groups were generally British educated and saw their own struggles as mirroring the 19th century political struggle for working class rights in Britain. The differences in status and aims of the various ethnic groups led to something of an ethnic divide in opposition groups. The most famous, the ANC, began as the South African Native National Congress in 1912 and became the African National Congress in 1923. For an in-depth study of its origins and early years, Andre Odendahl's excellent book The Founders is well worth investing in. It should be on the shelf of any history classroom where A-level or IB diploma is taught. The African Political Organisation, which represented coloureds, was founded in 1902, while the South African Indian Congress was founded in 1923. Their actions were limited and failed to make any meaningful impact, leading to some disillusionment with the leaders and criticism that they were not radical enough. Therefore, there were some limited attempts to radicalise opposition, most notably through the Industrial and Commercial Workers' Union, which originated in Cape Town in 1919. The leaders of the ICU used stronger rhetoric and incited members to refuse to work, break contract and even steal. However, it was ruthlessly suppressed, particularly through the 1924 Industrial Conciliation Act, which banned membership of trade unions, and the failure to make any major breakthrough, as well as internal divisions, saw it die out in the early 1930s. I hope you've enjoyed this overview of segregation and black opposition to it. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe by pressing the red subscribe button below. Next week we'll consider economic development during the segregation era.